about 100 years or so ago, and as a former obstetrics nurse, I was particularly interested in the recommendations for mothers after giving birth. One guide read, "After all that a newly made mother has undergone, she needs perfect quiet for several hours before she is permitted to see anyone. A 5-minute interview with her husband is all that should be allowed. Even if the new mother insists that she is well enough to see her friends and family, it is critical that she not be allowed any company until she has adequate rest. Excitement is dangerous, and no visitor can be permitted to enter the room, nor should any conversation be allowed, even if the mother wishes. Neglect of this precaution," it says, "may cause serious disaster." There's a 1916 book titled The Mother and Her Child, and it recommends that you should handle the baby as little as possible. Turn it occasionally from side to side, feed it, change it, keep it warm, and let it alone. Thank goodness we have learned a lot in that time, and that we have made changes. We've come a long way. The portions of Peter's letter that we read today is a kind of writing that was known at the time as a household code. These household codes were common in the Roman and Greek societies, and the codes gave advice on how to run a household, what the relationships should be between members of the family, and how the various levels of slaves and servants should function. Households at that time would have been much larger than they are today, with a wide, extended family, people working in the household, maybe more like a family business today, or a close-knit community like a small congregation. And if you think that the advice for mothers from 100 years ago sounds outdated, the advice for households from 1,950 years ago seems even more so. Even with that modernized language of the message, Peter's directives can seem antiquated, even oppressive with his mention of servants or slaves and the idea of submission. But what we miss, due to the distance of time and culture, is how revolutionary and transformative Peter's household code was compared to the other codes of the time. The typical household codes, for example, were always addressed to the men who was at the head of a household. By comparison, Peter begins his by writing, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles." He begins by writing to the outsiders. And then he goes on to speak directly to those slaves, those servants. And in the paragraph that follows on from the passage that I just read, he addresses the women directly, the wives, and then lastly, the husbands. Peter writes to each and every person in the household, and he gives each one respect. He values their role. He empowers each person to make choices to live in the way of Jesus Christ. The typical Greco-Roman household codes assumed that women and slaves were the property of the head of the household, to be managed as they saw fit. In fact, Aristotle, who wrote a household code, argued in his code that it was impossible for slaves to suffer unjustly, since they were simply property. But Peter, on the other hand, in this letter, acknowledges in verse 19 the pain of unjust suffering, of being treated badly for no good reason. But you still might wonder if there is anything in this passage which would be relevant for us today, if it had anything at all to say to us. And I believe that it does. But before I begin to explore that, I want to make one corrective note. I want to acknowledge that this text has been misused and misinterpreted over the years by preachers and by men in power to perpetuate injustice and to silence those without power. Sadly, too many have interpreted Peter as saying good Christians need to put up and shut up, but that is not what Peter is saying. He is not saying that women should quietly endure abuse, or that employees need to accept discriminatory treatment without complaint. This is where Peter's paraphrase helps us to gain a better understanding, because he rewords some of those words that have become loaded for us, like that word submit. And so I want to apologize to anyone who may have suffered as a result of the misuse of this text. And I hope to lead us to a better understanding. Peter is calling believers to find the balance of living in the world but not of it. We live within the nations and the cultures which God places us, and we seek to bring to them the distinctive example of Jesus. We seek to be the best ambassadors for Christ that we can be. And that's the crux of Peter's concern in this passage. He has just told the congregations that they are built together to hold God's presence in the world, like a temple. And they are to serve the world, like priests. Therefore, he says, follow a lifestyle that makes non-believers around you wonder what makes you different. The ultimate goal is to enable them to see the difference that God makes in your life and to see God. Some theologians call this soft resistance. Jesus did it by gently chiding his disciples, by asking questions of the religious leaders of the time, by saying things to make people wonder and to take another look at themselves and to think about God in new ways and to recognize God right there in their midst. I'm going to point to 4 principles of lifestyle witness that Peter teaches in this part of his letter. First is that God is the number one priority. Throughout his instructions, it is clear that God is the first priority. Peter writes, make the master proud and revere God. He writes, what counts is that you put up with it for God's sake. The focus is on honoring God, on winning people over to God's side, so that we and they may one day glorify God together. God is number one. Peter advises that we should be good citizens, to respect authority, to follow the rule of law. He says that God's will is that ideally national leaders are put in places of power to keep order. But Peter is not naive. He himself had to deal with instances when the demands of the authorities were in conflict with the will of God. Acts chapter 4 and 5 tell a story of when Peter healed a man in the courts of the temple and then began to teach the people that were there about the healing plan of God through Jesus. The religious teachers arrested Peter and demanded that he stop teaching in Jesus' name. But Peter responded to them, do you think God wants us to obey you rather than him? We cannot stop telling about everything we have seen and heard. And again, when they put him on trial, Peter says, we must obey God rather than human authority. So Peter is asking believers to respect human leaders and to live under their rules and be part of the structure that God desires, but to do that holding God and God's will as our first priority. Next, Peter says, conduct yourselves honorably. The next principle of lifestyle witness is living honorably. In verse 12, in the NRSV and NLT version, it reads, conduct yourselves honorably among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God. And again in verse 15, it is God's will that your honorable lives should silence ignorant people who make false accusations against you. The Oxford Dictionary has a whole list of synonyms for the word honorable: honest, moral, ethical, principled, trustworthy, credible, dependable, good, fair, reliable. Increasingly in politics and business, it seems like it no longer matters what someone's character is as long as he or she achieves a goal. There's a sense that the ends justify the means, and it no longer matters how many people may be harmed along the way. It doesn't matter how many lives may be lost as long as my rights aren't infringed. But no, Peter says, we need to live lives of integrity. We need to be willing to follow Jesus' teaching each step of the way, even if it costs me something, even if it's more difficult and more challenging way to go. I may need to suffer as Christ did, he says. Then third, be respectful. That's the third principle of lifestyle witness. Be respectful of others, of everyone, the vulnerable and the powerful, the kind and the nasty, the fair and the unfair. As representatives of Jesus Christ, we use respectful language and we respect everyone. There was a small business where the boss could hear everything the receptionist said as she took calls on the phone. The receptionist was efficient in her work, always on time. She had creative ideas for the different challenges that they faced in the office, but the boss called her in one day to talk about her behavior on the phone. The boss noted that on some calls, the receptionist was pleasant and helpful. But there were other calls where she was rude and demanding and abrupt. The receptionist explained to her boss, I treat people pretty much the way they treat me. If they're kind, I'm the same way. But we have some clients who can be unkind, and I have no intention of changing how I act towards them. If they want to be treated better, then they need to fix their attitudes, she said. The boss was floored, and he explained, but that is not how I want it around here. You will treat every customer kindly, no matter how they treat you. And on hearing that, it was the receptionist's turn to be floored. She couldn't understand. She responded, why should I do that? If they're rude to me, they don't deserve kindness. In our age of social media, it's so easy to lash out at those whom we don't like with verbal attacks, with taunting tweets, with name-calling menis. Peter urges believers to be respectful of all people, to treat everyone with dignity, because that's what Jesus did. We don't deserve grace. We get it, given to us with love, even when we don't deserve it. When Jesus was taunted, he did not retaliate. When he was falsely accused, he he did not threaten. And finally, cultivate inner beauty. Peter lifts up a principle of lifestyle witness that what is on the inside matters so much more than what is on the outside. I'm going to read to you the next few verses of 1 Peter that continue on from what is printed on the back of your bulletin. It's the passage that goes on to talk about wives and husbands. The same goes for you wives. Be good wives to your husbands, responsive to their needs. There are husbands who, indifferent as they are to any words about God, will be captivated by your life of holy beauty. What matters is not your outward appearance, the styling of your hair, the jewelry you wear, the cut of your clothes, but your inner disposition. Cultivate inner beauty, the gentle, gracious kind that God delights in. The same goes for you husbands. Be good husbands to your wives. Honor them, delight in them. As women, they lack some of your advantages, but in the new life of God's grace, you're equals. Treat your wives then as equals, so your prayers don't run aground. At the center of Peter's household code is the example of Jesus Christ. The kind of life we're invited into is the kind of life that Jesus lived. He lived that way so that we would know how it's done, so that we would know how to do it. We were once lost sheep, but we have been found by the shepherd. There are more lost sheep that need to find their way, and so we shape our whole lives, our lifestyles, in such a way that it speaks of Jesus and of his love. In those verses, just before Jesus lifts up the example of Christ, which is at the heart of his household code, he speaks about what counts with God. If you look at the passage that's on the back of the bulletin, in verse 19, it says, what counts is that you put up with it, with mistreatment, for God's sake. And again in verse 20, that's what counts with God. That word that's been translated counts is actually in Greek, charis, which means grace. What counts, what is God's grace displayed in our lives, is that we might follow Jesus. The grace that is what counts. The grace that Christ extended to every person and extends to you and to me is the grace that we too then extend to the world in Jesus' name. I'm going to invite the praise team and